check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys. It sound right, boys. Sound right, boys. It sound right, boy.
Boa noite, galera. Bem-vindos, bem-vindas todas a mais um Zup Open Talks. Dessa vez, num dia que a gente não está acostumado a fazer, num horário que a gente também nunca fez, mas é por um motivo especial. Nosso convidado de hoje é muito especial e era o dia e horário que ele podia vir com a gente bater esse papo. Quer trabalhar numa empresa que se preocupa com o desenvolvimento da tua carreira, que desenvolve tecnologia incrível e que acredita que para desenvolver tecnologia incrível você precisa ter gente incrível? Então vem trabalhar na Zup, galera. O pessoal vai colar ali na descrição o linkzinho para as vagas. Vem trabalhar na Zup. A gente acredita que sem pessoas incríveis a gente não consegue fazer nada incrível. Nosso crescimento é exponencial e por isso a gente precisa que as pessoas se desenvolvam de forma exponencial. Então, bem-vindos, venham trabalhar com a gente aqui. E para quem não conhece ainda os nossos projetos Open Source, opensource.zup.com.br, lá a gente tem 4 projetos Open Source, já temos uma boa comunidade de usuários e de pessoas que passaram esse mês de outubro todo fazendo contribuições durante o Hacktoberfest com o nosso projeto. Então, quer começar a trabalhar com o projeto Open Source e não sabe como é que faz? Que tal começar trabalhando com o projeto Open Source, que está cheio de brasileiro desenvolvendo? É só ir lá no site, conhecer os projetos e entrar em contato com a gente, baixar o software, começar utilizando e mandar o feedback para a gente. Pode mandar issue, pode mandar correção de documentação, podem escrever artigos, existem várias formas de contribuir. Aliás, tem uma postagem no nosso blog que saiu há alguns dias falando exatamente sobre isso. Esqueci de fazer minha autodescrição. Sou um homem branco, estou de cabelo preso, tenho a barba mais branca do que eu gostaria que ela fosse. Atrás de mim tem alguns instrumentos musicais e uma luzinha azul. E vou chamar, então, o nosso convidado para o dia de hoje. Galera, eu conheci ele há muitos anos atrás e eu conheci ele como o pai da internet. Então, este é o cara que está vindo aqui, um dos principais responsáveis pela criação da rede mundial. So, now I'm going to invite Mr. Vint CERF. Very welcome, Vint, to Zup Open Talks. Thank you so much to dedicate a part of your time to be here telling this wonderful story for us.
Obrigado, Jomar, and good afternoon, everyone. I wish I could address you in Portuguese, but unfortunately I'm not skilled in that language, so forgive me if I retreat into English. I'm Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, and I've been there since 2005. But some of you will know that I've been involved in the development of the Internet since actually before the Internet, starting with the 1969 ARPANET project. I'm going to cover some of that material today. My purpose is to persuade you that despite the fact that the Internet and its architecture are on the order of 50 years old, it has been evolving since that time. And it continues to evolve. It's still a very open architecture. It's amenable to new protocols, to new additions to its functionality. And nothing could be more dramatic, of course, than the arrival of the World Wide Web in 1991 as an example of expanding the Internet's functionality. So I want to persuade you that there's still plenty of work to be done. There's still hard problems to solve. There's still room for evolution and improvement. And we'll cover that during the course of this lecture. I'm happy to answer questions, which we'll try to organize when I've finished with my primary presentation. So I'm going to share my screen now and hope that I do this right. In order to give you a better sense of what I think is still possible and what the challenges are that lie ahead of us. So just to check, am I audible and can you see the screen?
Yes, it's perfect.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so I call this the unfinished Internet simply because there are many things that it could do and should do that it does not yet do. And many of those things may fall to you and your colleagues to develop. So let's go back in history, at least for a moment. Now here are examples of people trying to predict the future that did not do very well. Mr. Dewell was the commissioner of the U.S. Patent Office, and in 1899 he said, "Everything that can be invented has been invented." and he was proposing to shut down the office as a result. Clearly a serious mistake. Here's another one. Mr. Krugman is quite a well-known economist, and his conclusion was in 1998, the year that Google was born, that by 2005, it'll become clear that the internet's impact on the economy has been no greater than the fax machines. Despite the fact that he won the Nobel Prize, it's clear that his intuition about the internet was mistaken. And here's one more lesson that I've learned over the course of my long career, and that is the closer you look at anything, the more complicated it gets. And so you should be prepared for that anything you look at closely will turn out to be more complicated than you expected. Now I want to take you back into history. It's December 1969. A 4-node packet switch network called the ARPANET is up and running at UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, SRI International, and the University of Utah. I'm a graduate student at UCLA. My job is to write the software for a Sigma 7 machine, to connect it to the ARPANET, and to use it to measure the performance of this 4-node packet switch network, and to compare the performance with predictions made with queuing theory models by Professor Leonard Kleinrock and his students. So I was the Network Measurement Center principal programmer. And in the course of that work, I was also involved in developing what were called the host protocols of the ARPANET. These were procedures that would allow these different gray machines, an IBM 360, an SDS 940, an XDS Sigma 7, and a Digital Equipment Corporation PDP-10, to interact with each other in an interoperable way. This was a major challenge because the machines were different word length, they had different operating systems, they were manufactured by different organizations. Getting them to interact uniformly across this packet switch network was a significant challenge. And a group called the Network Working Group, led by my best friend, Steve Crocker, solved that problem with something called the Network Control Protocol. Well, the success of the ARPANET led us to consider the possibility of building a multi-network system in order to support military command and control, keeping in mind this network was underwritten by the Defense Department in the United States, and they concluded that computers could be used for command and control. But that meant that you had to put computers in ships at sea, in airplanes, and in mobile vehicles. The ARPANET that you're looking at was built out of dedicated telephone circuits, but you can't connect the tanks and the ships with telephone circuits because they get all tangled up. So Bob Kahn, who was one of the key architects of the ARPANET, came to my office at Stanford University in 1973 and explained that we had a problem. How do we build different packet switch nets to handle ground mobile traffic, ships at sea with long distance communication, and the original ARPANET? How do we hook all of those together and make them look like a single network? That was the internet problem. And just to demonstrate how primitive the technology of the ARPANET was, in 1994, 3 of us got together and spent the entire day setting up this photograph for Newsweek magazine. And you can see we had to get green zucchinis and yellow squash and a yellow plastic cable and 5-pound tins of coffee to demonstrate how primitive the technology was. But I want you to look carefully at the photo because you'll see that it would never work. There were ear-to-ear connections, and there were a mouth-to-mouth connection, but there was no mouth-to-ear connection. This network would never work. And we did that as a geek joke just to see whether anybody who was reading Newsweek magazine would recognize it. So that was our contribution to humor for the day. As I skip forward now to 1977, Bob Kahn and I published a paper describing what became the TCP protocol and then evolved into TCP/IP. By 1977, we were able to demonstrate the interoperation of 3 different packet switch networks: the packet radio net in the San Francisco Bay Area, the packet satellite net over the Atlantic Ocean, linking Western Europe to Eastern US, and the ARPANET, which by this time had grown outside of its original US limits and was extended to operate across the Atlantic into Europe over an internal satellite link in the ARPANET. So there were 2 satellite hops in this picture. We had a mobile vehicle driving up and down the Bayshore Freeway in the San Francisco area, radiating packets to go through a gateway between the packet radio net and the ARPANET. The routing system was set to send the traffic all the way over to Europe and then to University College London, and then exit the ARPANET into a gateway that would take the traffic into the packet satellite net, which brought the packets all the way across the Atlantic again, and through another gateway into the ARPANET again, and then all the way through the ARPANET to USC, Information Sciences Institute, in the Los Angeles area. The distance between the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles is about 400 miles. But the packets traveled about 100,000 miles because they went through 2 synchronous satellite hops up and down. So that's already 22,000 up and down. That's 44,000 plus another up and down hop. That's 88,000 plus back and forth across the Atlantic and also across the United States. So, and amazingly, it actually worked. And this was a very important demonstration that the TCP/IP protocols would function using these very different packet switch nets with different data rates, different latencies, different word sizes, different loss rates, different data rates. And yet the TCP/IP protocol was able to glue all of this together and look very uniform. So this was an important demonstration on that date, many, many years ago. The success of this new protocol led to 3 additional backbone networks being built in the United States and funded by the US government. One of them was built by the National Science Foundation in order to link 3,000 research universities across the United States to supercomputer centers that were 5 different supercomputer centers to support academic research computing. In the mid-1980s, the Department of Energy, which also had laboratories around the United States, decided they would make use of the same technology, the TCP/IP technology, to build their energy sciences network, which is still in operation today. NASA also, in the same time frame, decided to link its laboratories together using TCP/IP and what it called the NASA Science Internet. The NSF net was shut down in 1995 because commercial networking was available to serve the academic community. ESNet and NSINet continue to operate as special networks of the Department of Energy and NASA, but they connect to the public internet, and they connect to a wide range of academic national research and education networks in all of the continents except, well, even Antarctica has a connection at McMurdo to the internet today. So we could see very rapid escalation of TCP/IP-based networks, first in the United States and then later in Europe and Asia. Today, the internet is serves about half of the world's population. So this is what the internet kind of looks like today, although I admit to you I'm cheating a little. This picture was generated in 1999 using the Border Gateway Protocol forwarding tables, just to give you an idea of the tens of thousands of networks that make up the internet. They each run independently of the other. They have their own business models. They use whatever hardware and software they choose. They connect to each other based on whatever negotiated deals they can make with other networks. It's fully distributed. The only centralization which takes place in this modern day internet, is to make sure that the domain names and internet addresses are allocated on a unique basis. And that process is done by the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, which is part of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers here in the United States. So the internet today is this enormous system which serves about half of the world's population and is continuing to grow. Well, this brings me to what I'll call unfinished business. And these are just examples of things that we are in the middle of wrestling with. For example, the Internet of Things, which is something I'm sure you're all familiar with, or otherwise sometimes called cyber physical systems, and artificial intelligence and machine learning are two very, very important foci for the internet today. And I would argue that in order to make use of these ideas, of these programmable devices that can talk to the internet, or devices that make use of machine learning, there are certain desirable properties that we would like these systems to exhibit. Among them are reliability, safety, privacy, security, interoperability, and autonomy. And by autonomy, I just mean that if you have a house full of Internet of Things devices, you want the house to keep working even if the internet connection isn't available. You certainly don't want a house that stops working just because the internet isn't there. And so you need this autonomy in order to have reliability and utility. We're still a long ways away from achieving all of those objectives, and I'll come back to them a bit later. In the meantime, the internet is evolving, especially once the World Wide Web arrived in 1991. And then as we started to see social networks coming up, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or Instagram or any of the other, the Chinese WeChat and so on, there are a variety of social networking applications that have come up on top of the World Wide Web. The problem that we've encountered is that those network systems, those social networking systems, are amplifiers of misinformation and disinformation, in addition to being useful mechanisms for distributing useful information. And so now we find ourselves struggling to figure out how to detect and filter out or warn people about misinformation and disinformation on the internet, whether it's in social media or other web pages. How do we recognize and do something about people who propagate misinformation and disinformation? One of the biggest challenges that we have is figuring out, first of all, that something is misinformation or disinformation, and second, whether we can figure out who is producing it and distributing it. One argument is that we should use machine learning or artificial intelligence to somehow apply it to the information that's flowing through the net and to filter out the bad stuff. I don't believe this is going to work very effectively. And although there are attempts to use artificial intelligence to do this filtering, I'm convinced that something else that's much more important that will work best is called critical thinking, where wetware up here is what gets people to filter out bad information. But the trouble is, exercising critical thinking takes effort, and not everyone is willing to put forward the effort to do that. But I think young people should be taught that there is bad information on the network, and that there are risks that you need to mitigate, some of them by taking action on your own. For example, using two-factor authentication to prevent hijacking of your accounts, or asking questions like, where did this information come from? Is there any corroborating evidence for claims that are being made? That takes work, and not everybody's willing to do that. But that leads us to the next bullet, which is digital literacy. And just in general, I'm persuaded that we need to teach people that they are at risk in online environments, and they need to understand how to defend themselves, how to maintain and configure and keep up-to-date software that you're relying on. Well, one of the methods that you use for dealing with bad behavior is to make the badly behaving people accountable for what they were doing. But in order to hold someone accountable, you have to know who it is. And since anonymity has been a common aspect of Internet's history, figuring out who is saying things or doing things is not so simple. And because people can be in different jurisdictions in different countries while they're behaving badly, it's almost certain that we're going to need international agreements in order to identify who those parties are and hold them accountable and hold them responsible for the harmful use of the internet, whether it's distributing malware, distributing misinformation, creating fraud, or bullying, or any of a number of other harmful behaviors. So we are going to need international agreements to decide how we identify parties behaving badly and whether or not we have reciprocity, a possibility of extradition and so on in order to hold people accountable. Which is what I mean. Traceability by design is just a fancy way of saying that we should design systems so that if somebody behaves badly, we can identify who they are. Now, there's another big problem in the internet, and it's true in general, not just for the internet, but for almost all software, and that's code which has bugs in it, which people exploit, and the exploitation we call malware. And I worry a lot about the fact that we haven't figured out how to write software that has no bugs in it, even though in theory programs have been written for over 80 years now, starting in the 1930s with Konrad Zuse and his computing machines. So because we haven't figured out how to avoid bugs in the code we write, other people exploit those mistakes to create malware. And it becomes a great concern that we rely on software to make important decisions. And yet if they have bugs in them, of course, the decisions may turn out to be wrong. And of course, the decisions could be bad decisions could have really severe consequences, especially if we're talking about a self-driving car or a self-flying drone or a robot, which is making decisions on its own. So this leads us to another responsibility that software producers have, in my view, and that's the ethical development of software. Taking care to make sure as few bugs as possible show up, making sure there's a way of upgrading software, which has been found to have bugs in it. We should feel a strong ethical principle, both as an institution and as individuals, to make sure that software-based systems are as bug-free as possible. We should develop ways of fixing the bugs, uploading software, and also making sure that we know whether the software we're getting is up to date and not altered on its path from the source to the destination. All of those things, I think, imply an ethical behavior that's required in these online systems. Well, this leads me to another big problem, which is only half the world's population has access to the internet. And we sometimes refer to this as a digital divide. And there are reasons for the lack of access to the internet. In some cases, there physically is no infrastructure to carry the data. There are no wires, there's no optical fiber, there's no radio connectivity. Another possibility, though, is that there may be infrastructure in place, but it might not be affordable by the population that needs access to it. And so that's an economic barrier. Figuring out how to drive cost out should be an important part of our job as engineers. Another possibility is that the reason that there isn't any internet available is that there is a poor quality policy adopted by the government that inhibits competition, for example. Some government agencies would like to have an agency that runs internet service and generates revenue for the government rather than relying on a private sector entity. And then finally, it may be that there isn't anybody around that knows how to run the internet. And so We need people who are locally trained, who speak the local language, who are trained to recognize and debug problems in the internet, or have the capacity to go build new pieces of internet and get them to interwork. And that's an educational limitation that needs to be corrected in order to get local buy-in to internet infrastructure construction. I just thought you might be as amazed as I am with the amount of optical fiber which has gone under the water to connect the continents together. In the last 25 or 30 years, an enormous amount of capacity has gone in to undersea cables. And they are, of course, linking together the universe of the internet on this planet. And the next thing that's happening, as I'm sure all of you know, is that low Earth orbiting satellites are the next major connectivity option, whether it's Starlink or O3b, OneWeb, or Kuiper. Most of these satellites, except for 13B, are in low Earth orbit. The O3b is more like 8,000 kilometers. But what's important is that if this initiative continues, if Starlink and O3b and OneWeb continue to implement the low Earth orbiting satellite constellations, at some point it may be impossible to avoid access to the internet, in which case you no longer have an excuse for not getting on, other than, for example, congestion or expense. So that's what's in store for us in terms of connectivity. To go back to the Internet of Things, I began wondering about this in the 1990s. And I remember making jokes like every light bulb in the internet will have its own IP address someday. It's not a joke anymore. There exist light bulbs that have IP addresses and have some TCP/IP implementations inside the light bulb on a chip. There are other things that surprise me, like the internet-enabled surfboard. Somebody back in the early 90s decided that they would build a laptop into the surfboard so they could be surfing the net while they're waiting for the next wave. And the guy put a mobile radio or something into the laptop, and then, or a Wi-Fi radio, and then also put a server, the Rescue Shack. So this allowed him to surf the internet while he's waiting for the next wave, which I thought was kind of cool. There's also appliances like internet-enabled refrigerators that could have the knowledge of what's inside, especially if there's an RFID chip associated with each food item. So when you come home, the display can show examples of things you could make with what you have in the refrigerator. Of course, if you're on a diet, maybe it'll come back and show you diet recipes, or maybe it'll just refuse to open because it knows you're on a diet. In any case, there are a variety of possibilities for these various Internet of Things devices. And I'm not going to go through all of them here, but I remember wondering, what could you do with an internet-enabled refrigerator? And one answer is, well, if the food has an RFID chip on it, then the refrigerator could know what it has inside. And so it can be suggesting recipes that you could make with what it has inside when you come home and see the display of what's inside and what recipes would work. And of course, if it turns out that the refrigerator is on the same network as the bathroom scale, then you run into a problem, because the refrigerator figures out, if it figures out you're on a diet, then when you come home, what you might see is just diet recipes coming up on the display, or maybe worse, the refrigerator refuses to open because it knows you're on a diet. So this is one of the problems of networking, unexpected consequences. One last point on this one, I kept thinking, what would you do with internet-enabled clothing? And I thought, well, let's see, if you have an RFID chip on your socks and you're missing sock number 342L, you could send an SNMP control message out saying, where is sock 344L? And you might get a message back saying, hi, this is sock 344L. I'm under the sofa in the living room. And now we've solved the problem of missing sock for the good of all mankind, a huge contribution to our society. So I'm sure you could make up a bunch of other things, but let's move on so that we have time for some questions. I had listed these properties earlier about reliability, safety, security, privacy, interoperability, and autonomy. And you can see why these might be important. You don't want devices that just work some of the time. And you certainly don't want devices that are known to be unsafe or insecure or that don't protect your privacy. And you certainly want to be able to buy these IoT devices from more than one vendor and have things interwork. And finally, as I pointed out before, that autonomy is important. It should work even if the internet connection isn't available. So the problem we have with IoT, and I'm going to spend a little time on IoT now, is that some designers have a very limited model of what it means to manage an IoT device. They think, okay, there's a user with a mobile, there's an app, there's the internet, there's the device, and I'm done. And although that's sort of true for one device, one app, if you have several hundred devices at home, which is not a crazy possibility, you need a much more thoughtful way of managing all of those systems. So we have to treat it as an entire ecosystem. Multiple devices with multiple brands should interwork, for which we need standards. And then there's this question of what to do when a new device shows up. What if somebody is just coming to deliver something, but your house detects that there's a new mobile or some other device? The question is, what should it do? I mean, should it send a note to you saying, should I configure this into the system? Should it send a note to the new device and say, hi, do you want to join our network? What should it do? And I think the answer is not clear. It depends on who the person is, in addition to what the person can see and hear. A similar question is with regard to software updates. The devices that need updating should know for sure that the that the update has come from a legitimate source. And so for that, you need some cryptographic checks, typically two-factor authentication or something, and also digital signatures to assure integrity of the update. And those are questions that your devices need to be able to answer in order to accept an upgrade of the software without ingesting malware. Then there's the question of what happens after you've done an update and everything stops working. I'm sure you've all had that problem before. So it's important to design updates so they can be backed out of. Then there's this question about diagnostics and performance metrics of the system so that you have some idea of what's going wrong if something is going wrong. And finally, you may need additional devices like hubs and firewalls in order to protect IoT devices from invasion by somebody trying to get access inappropriately or under some kind of pressure by hackers. You need to have the ability to defend against that. And it could be that a simple little internet light bulb isn't capable of defending itself adequately. There's a scaling problem too. I mean, if you had a house full of 100 of these devices and then you moved in with another 100 devices, who's going to do all the configuring? The last thing you want is to type IPv6 addresses for the next 3 days to configure the network. And there's this question about differentiating among users, because if parents, kids, guests, and emergency responders all have different privileges, or should have different privileges, to use the IoT devices in your home. And the question is, how do you decide who gets what authority? How do you decide how those are granted and for how long? How do you rescind authority? What if you have a house guest and the house guest leaves and you want to give them access to the facilities, but you don't want them to persist in having access to control of your network until when they leave? The same argument could be made for emergency responders who should have access to the equipment while they're present, but when they leave, that access should go away. Sorry, that's my phone, which is making noise. Sorry about that. So you can see, here's an example of an episodic access scenario. Suppose the house is on fire and the fire department is on its way. And in that particular instance, it might be good for them to have access to the webcams that are in the house so they can see if anybody is unconscious or where the fire is burning. After the fire is put out, you don't want the fire department to continue to have access to your webcams because your privacy would be at risk. How do you design systems that allow for this kind of episodic authentication and authorization and then removal that's convenient and easy and straightforward for ordinary users? And you can see this list of other questions that arise as you start to think about the scaling of IoT devices and their transfer from one owner to another, all of which needs to be properly considered when you design and build these systems and their support. At one point, I thought about asking our marketing department to change the name of the Android operating system to Paranoid, because I wanted to illustrate how careful and thoughtful we were about security and safety and the like. But they didn't think that that would be a very good marketing tactic, and so they declined the opportunity. But I am worried about protecting devices that have limited computing capability from malware attacks and denial of service attacks. So firewalls or filtering hubs or other things may be necessary to defend some of the IoT devices in your home or your office. Similarly, when you're commissioning an IoT device, you want it to limit its dialogue to devices that are owned and operated by people you trust, whether it's the fire department or the electrical power department or something else. So you want to build in strong authentication so that a device can't be controlled by an unauthorized party or doesn't disgorge information to an unauthorized party. So cryptography and things and strong authentication are important here. And there has to be a way of recovering from failure, including factory resets. I think these devices probably should be instrumented so that if something goes wrong, you could look at a circular buffer, for example, to see what was it doing in the run-up to some big failure. And of course, diagnostic tools would be very useful to have. Ethics, I think, plays a real role here in IoT. One of them is the willingness of a provider to maintain the software over time, as opposed to selling you something and then saying a year later, I'm sorry, I'm not supporting it anymore. I think we all have an ethical responsibility to avoid creating vulnerable software which can be exploited. We need to build systems that are resistant to personal attack or external attack and certainly protect our privacy. We want things to be accessible and useful, which means we should be thinking about how to make it work for someone who's blind or deaf or has a motor impairment. And finally, if it turns out that a company is going to go out of business before the lifetime of the device is adequately exhausted, then maybe it would be ethically good practice to keep the source code in escrow so that if some third party says, I'm willing to support this even if you can't, that they can get access to the code through the escrow mechanism. Standards are incredibly important just for achieving interoperability, and I don't think I need to say much more about that. I'm sure you all appreciate that the standards are what makes things interwork. And finally, I think we're going to put billions of these devices to work, and some of them will get inadequate or no support after installation, which I consider to be an abrogation of responsibility. Some may not meet the reliability, privacy, and safety expectations that you have. So we have some serious problems that are associated with this proliferation of IoT devices. I think new jobs are going to be created, like somebody who does the install of these things and has experience figuring out how to get them to work. And so I think this new trend of IoT devices either is going to herald a utopian future or usher in a new nightmare. And it's our job collectively to make sure that it's the former and not the latter. Now, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to mention two other things, and then I think we should pause for questions. I have two other projects that I just want to draw your attention to. One of them is to examine and demonstrate the cognitive capacity of non-human species it's becoming increasingly clear that gorillas and whales and dolphins and so on have a considerable degree of cognitive capacity. And our question is, could we get two non-human species to communicate with each other? And if they're not co-located, could we do that through the internet? So that's what this project is about. You'll find it at interspecies.io. And that would be worth you're looking into if you're curious about that. It started in 2013 and is still going on. We have a couple of hundred researchers who are interested in animal cognition, looking at whether we could build an application on the internet that would allow two non-human species to communicate with each other. And then the other project, which some of you will have heard about, is the interplanetary internet, which was started in 1998 upon the arrival of the spacecraft, the Pathfinder project, and the Sojourner rover that arrived on Mars successfully for the first time in 1997, after about 20 years of failure, which in 1996 was a successful landing of Viking 1 and 2, but then after that, nothing worked for 20 years. So the interplanetary internet is all about extending the operation of the internet beyond the solar system. And if you're interested in this particular project, there's something called ipnsig.org, ipnsig.org. And that has been running as a special interest group of the Internet Society since 1998. And if you go there, you'll find all kinds of current status on the implementation of the interplanetary backbone, the implementation of the new network protocols that are needed in order to support that. I'm going to stop there. There's lots of other stuff, but I'm worried that you might not have an opportunity to ask questions. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point and invite questions.
Hi guys. You can send questions on chat, then I can read to him. The first one that we already received is from Leonardo. If you have seen Destiny Sending's recent work on internet security, and if so, what do you think about it?
So I am actually persuaded that we are improving our ability to increase security in the internet. And I think many of you will have noticed that we are retrofitting a number of security mechanisms into the system. The introduction of HTTPS and the use of TLS is an example of that. The recent introduction of a new protocol called QUIC from Google, QUIC, is another attempt at doing three things at once: collapsing the TLS and the TCP protocol functionality into a single protocol with a rapid recovery of cryptographic variables in order to recover from a broken connection. And that's now standardized by the Internet Engineering Task Force. Another thing which is being implemented is called MANRS, M-A-N-R-S, and that's to get the RPKI, public key infrastructure, in place in order to protect the backbone routing systems, the border gateway protocols. There's still some work to be done there because right now the current implementations will verify the route origin data, but it doesn't necessarily verify the path over which the updates have taken place. And so that's still to be implemented. But I would argue that we're making increasing use of cryptography and public key cryptography in order to deal with routing updates that aren't hijacked. There's also strong two-factor authentication that's being used in order to avoid hijack of accounts that normally just use usernames and passwords. So I am confident that all of these steps and more are going to reinforce the ability of the internet to resist various and sundry kinds of attack. This doesn't mean our job is done, but it does mean that there's an increasing opportunity to help people protect themselves in addition to building systems that are more resistant to various kinds of attack.
Okay, we were talking the other day about the impact of the internet on the pandemics. When you started working with the network, did you guys imagine that it would be so important to keep the humanity as we know because of an event like pandemics?
Well, we weren't thinking about pandemics necessarily, but what we were thinking about is command and control for the Defense Department. We know that's a stressful and very demanding capability. We knew that it would require voice, video, and data. Even as far back as the late 1970s, we were beginning to experiment with packet voice and packet video. And so we knew it had to be resilient. We knew it had to be resistant to attack. We knew we needed cryptography for confidentiality. And so there are all of those things, plus experience with the ARPANET, which we'd gotten from the invention of remote access to time-shared machines, file transfers between those machines, and eventually email, which was the killer app for the ARPANET for quite a long time. The other thing that happened along with the email was distribution lists. And you could think of a distribution list as a kind of a weak form of social network. And we could see the utility of the distribution list almost instantly. And we could also see that it had commercial utility, or at least, let me say, non-military, non-business utility. We could see that the general public could benefit from email and distribution lists. In fact, the first few distribution lists that were invented were social media. And in fact, one of them was called Sci-Fi Lovers, people who enjoyed science fiction and were sharing their opinions about authors and books. The other one that I remember joining was called Yum Yum, which was a restaurant review in the Palo Alto area, which expanded over a larger geography. Here's the thing that we didn't understand. When email came along, we thought that the travel would be reduced and we could work with each other over multiple time zones, because you could send a message to someone while they were asleep and they could read it when they woke up and send you a message, and you could read it when you woke up. And so we thought this would be great. We wouldn't have to travel as much. Then we looked at the travel budgets 4 years later, and they'd gone up by a factor of 2. And the question is, what happened? And the answer was, well, we indeed were able to manage projects over bigger time zones. And that meant there were more people involved. But when we did have to get together face to face, we traveled longer distances and there were more of us. So the budget went up instead of down, in spite of, because of the facilitating effect of computer mediated communication. So we didn't anticipate all the things that happened. Now I will say that none of us, at least me anyway, did not anticipate what happens when you take the handheld mobile phone, turn it into a smartphone, and then meld it with the internet. And the irony of that story, which of course is Steve Jobs and the iPhone, and the brilliance of putting a camera onto a telephone and then equipping it with radio connectivity, the brilliance of all that is that it made the internet and the smartphone each mutually more useful. The smartphone made the internet more accessible, and the internet made the smartphone more useful because of all the apps you could do using internet resources. And so these things have been mutually enforcing for quite a while.
Yeah, and what do you believe is it's the biggest challenge that we have with the network today?
Well, I think abuse on the network is by far the biggest challenge. People who take advantage of its utility, its amplifying effect, and use it to cause harmful things to happen, whether it's distribution of malware or spam, or denial of service attacks using botnets, or spreading of misinformation and disinformation, bullying, and there's this long list of things that happen in the social media. What I think has been missing from the internet's arc has been sociologists, psychologists, neuroscientists, and anthropologists to help us understand the human nature, human behavior in the presence of these amplifying environments. whether it's feedback loops in the social media or simply the ability to send millions of copies of spam to everywhere, or other kinds of large-scale broadcast capability. So I think we need to learn more about how and why people behave the way they do. You'll notice that we still read Shakespeare, even though he wrote his plays 400 years ago, because they still exhibit all of the foibles of human nature, our weaknesses and our strengths. And these we need to take into account when we think about how people use the internet. It's made more complicated by the fact that the internet is global in scope. The packets don't know when they've crossed international boundaries. And so we need real cooperation on an international basis in order to track down and hold to account people doing harmful things on the network. We need to do that in a cooperative way, which is why the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, is asking for and promoting a digital cooperation roadmap in order to cope with some of these very serious international problems.
Yes, and also over the past years, we saw a lot of countries trying to write legislation about internet. We had our Marco Civil, the internet in Brazil, that you know a lot about. And do you think that this tentative of putting local roles without taking too much care that this is an international environment could be a risky to start fragmenting the network?
Well, yes, absolutely. Now, Marco Civil, I was around in Brazil during the time that was being legislated. I was there for the 2014 conference where a really interesting set of principles was developed. And I am persuaded that those contributions were helpful because they established at least a set of norms that one could consider adopting, and those norms were not necessarily in conflict with each other. However, there are signs that countries are trying to legislate protections for their citizens. As an example, there's a term called data sovereignty, which roughly speaking says that if there's personal information about our citizens, the information has to stay inside of a geopolitical boundary. What that tends to do is fragment the internet. It inhibits the ability to move data freely between one country and another. That's actually not a good thing, because the ability to move data around is exactly what made the internet so valuable. It made you can get to any web page anywhere in the world. Getting access to information is incredibly important and valuable. Sharing of information is valuable, as long as you can filter out the misinformation and the disinformation. So by trying to draw a boundary around a country and saying certain information has to stay here, you interfere with that free flow of information. By the way, it also messes up cloud computing, because cloud computing, at least as we implemented at Google, means moving data between data centers over a dedicated backbone network in order to replicate the data and make sure nothing is lost, even if a whole data center goes away. And if we're not permitted to copy the data, then we can't provide the protections that a multi-data center system would offer. So there are reasons to want to keep this as open as possible, recognizing that we still have to deal with privacy and confidentiality. But the way to do that is to use cryptography and digital signatures and strong authentication in order to protect the data at the right layer in the architecture, and not try to protect it by limiting the routing capability of the currently global internet to move data anywhere that it seems useful to do so.
Okay, amazing. So we have a last one. I know we have a very busy agenda, but we can close with this one. In your opinion, which was the greatest mistake in the construction of the internet? Believe 32 bits would be enough, or what?
Well, that would be one, obviously. And Bob Kahn and I did math, and we thought in 1973 that 4.3 billion terminations was enough. And that was more than there were people in the world at the time. Actually, one of the most significant mistakes, which is partly solved by the quick protocol, is that I bound the TCP connections to the IP address too tightly. And at the time, I was trying to save bits. And I realized much later that it meant that mobility between networks was not properly dealt with, because if you change your IP address, you break the TCP connection. In the quick protocol, a cryptographic variable is shared by the two parties. And if there's a broken connection, as long as both parties remember their shared cryptographic variable, either one or the other could move to a different IP address and say, hi, I'm the same person, and to prove it, here's my crypto variable. And the other guy can test whether he's got the private key that goes with the public key and so on. And so that's actually quite a brilliant new addition to the protocol suite that would deal with one problem that I screwed up way back in the mid-1970s.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing with us the history and answering our questions. Really appreciate this. I know you have a very busy agenda, and I'm really happy that you accepted to be here talking to us.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of the show. I appreciate it and wish you all very well. You know, keep working on the internet. There's still lots of work to be done.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Good night. We see in 2 weeks, and I have an excellent surprise for you in 2 weeks, because without the story about how Linux was born, today we are covering how the internet was born, and I guess you may be curious about how the social network was born, right?
Wow.
So I have news for you on the end of the month. Thank you so much, Vint.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Take care. Thank you, Adonai.